There is a comforting story we tell ourselves, that war is a modern invention, that our ancient ancestors lived in harmony with each other and the land, and that it was civilization, agriculture, borders, and kings that corrupted us into killers. It is a beautiful idea, and the bones buried beneath the sands of northern Sudan prove it is a lie. In 1964, an American archaeologist named Fred Wendorf was excavating along the banks of the Nile, near the border of Egypt and Sudan, when his team uncovered something that would haunt the field of anthropology for decades. Buried in a prehistoric cemetery, now known as Jebel Sahaba, or Cemetery 117, lay the remains of 61 men, women, and children. They had been dead for nearly 14,000 years, and they had not died peacefully. Nearly half of them, at least 45%, bore unmistakable evidence of violent death. Sharpened stone projectile points were found embedded deep in their bones, lodged between ribs, buried in spinal columns, driven into skulls. These were not hunting accidents. The points were crafted from flint and chert, designed to pierce flesh, and they had been fired or thrust into these people with lethal intent. Some of the victims were children, no older than 4 or 5. Others were elderly women. This was not a battle between rival warriors meeting on an open field. This was the systematic slaughter of an entire community. But here is what makes Jebel Sahaba truly chilling. When researchers examined the bones more closely, they found something unexpected. Many of the skeletons carried healed wounds alongside the fresh fatal ones, old fractures that had mended, projectile scars that had calcified over months or even years. These people had survived violence before. They had been attacked, wounded, recovered, and then attacked again. Jebel Sahaba was not a single catastrophic event. It was evidence of repeated, sustained, organized violence stretching across years, possibly generations. 14,000 years ago, long before the first city was ever built, long before the first field was ever planted, human beings were already waging something that looked unmistakably like war.
The context makes it even more haunting. 14,000 years ago, the world was emerging from the last ice age. The Sahara, which had once been a green, fertile savanna dotted with lakes and rivers, was beginning its long transformation into the largest desert on Earth. As the land dried, populations that had been spread across thousands of miles were slowly squeezed into the only corridor that still offered water, food, and life: the Nile Valley. Imagine it. Bands of hunter-gatherers who had never needed to compete with each other were suddenly crowded along the same narrow ribbon of fertile riverbank. Fish, game, wild grains, everything they depended on existed in a shrinking strip of land that more and more people were claiming as their own. The conditions were a pressure cooker, and at Jebel Sahaba, that pressure exploded. For years, some scholars tried to argue that Jebel Sahaba was an anomaly, a tragic but isolated case. They insisted that true warfare could only emerge alongside agriculture, permanent settlements, stored surplus, and the concept of property. War, they claimed, required something worth fighting over. Then, in 2012, a team led by Marta Mirazan-Lar of Cambridge University was conducting a survey near the western shore of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya when they stumbled upon a site called Nataruk. What they found there dismantled that argument entirely. 27 skeletons lay scattered across what had once been the edge of a lagoon, dating back roughly 10,000 years. The remains told a story of extreme, deliberate brutality. 10 of the bodies showed clear signs of violent death. Skulls had been caved in by blunt force, likely from clubs or heavy wooden implements. Obsidian blade tips, sharp as surgical glass, were found lodged in the bones of at least 2 individuals. One victim was a pregnant woman in her final trimester, found in a position suggesting her hands had been bound. These were not soldiers. These were not settlers defending a wall or a granary. The people at Nataruk were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They owned no land. They stored no grain. They had no permanent homes. And yet someone had hunted them down and executed them beside a lake. Nataruk shattered the comfortable theory that war was born from civilization. These people had no civilization in the way we define it. No pottery, no metal, no written laws. They moved with the seasons, followed the herds, and gathered what the land provided. And still, they were massacred. The evidence forced a deeply uncomfortable question. If war did not begin with property, cities, or kings, then where did it come from? Is it possible that organized violence is not a corruption of human nature, but an expression of it?
This is where the debate gets fierce. In the 1960s, anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon spent years living among the Yanomami people of the Amazon rainforest, one of the most isolated societies on Earth. He documented relentless cycles of raids, ambushes, and revenge killings between villages, and he labeled them the fierce people. His work suggested that violence was deeply woven into even the simplest human societies. Critics attacked him viciously, accusing him of cultural bias and of projecting Western ideas of savagery onto indigenous people. They pointed to other forager groups that appeared remarkably peaceful. The argument consumed anthropology for decades, and in many ways it still does. But while anthropologists debated ideology, primatologists were uncovering evidence that pushed the roots of organized violence even deeper. In 1974, Jane Goodall was observing a community of chimpanzees in Gombe, Tanzania, when something unprecedented happened. A group of males from the Kasekela community began systematically hunting down and killing members of a neighboring group called the Kahama. Over the course of 4 years, from 1974 to 1978, the Kasekela males conducted raid after raid, ambushing isolated Kahama individuals, beating them, biting them, and leaving them to die. By the end, the Kahama community had been completely annihilated. Goodall, who had spent a career celebrating the intelligence and emotional depth of chimpanzees, was devastated. She later wrote that the Gombe War forced her to accept a darkness she had never wanted to see. If our closest living relatives were capable of coalitionary killing, of planned, cooperative violence aimed at destroying a rival group, then the capacity for war might not be thousands of years old. It might be millions. The emerging picture is as stark as it is unsettling. War does not require empires. It does not require ideology, religion, or nationhood. What it requires is far simpler: competition for resources in an environment that cannot support everyone. When the Sahara dried and the Nile Valley became crowded, Jebel Sahaba happened. When rival bands encountered each other near a resource-rich lagoon in Kenya, Natarok happened. When chimpanzee territory shrank and food became scarce, the Gombe War happened. The pattern repeats across species, across continents, across millennia. We did not invent war when we invented civilization. We industrialized it. We gave it flags, anthems, and satellite-guided missiles. But the instinct, the cold calculus of destroying the other group before they destroy yours, was carved into our lineage long before the first stone wall was ever raised.
And yet, for all the darkness buried in those ancient graves, humanity's story is not only written in blood. Sometimes the most world-changing moments in our history came not from violence or ambition, but from sheer, blind luck. Discoveries made entirely by accident. Mistakes that reshaped medicine, technology, and the way we understand the universe. If you want to see the other side of human nature, the part that stumbles into brilliance without even trying, check out our video on human discoveries made entirely by accident. Because the same species that buried its dead at Jebel Sahaba also accidentally discovered penicillin, X-rays, and the microwave. And that might be the strangest thing about us.